Good morning, and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. I'm Carlin Bowman, and I'm a senior fellow here at AEI. And it's a very special pleasure today for me to welcome our friends from Brigham Young University and the Deseret News, who conceived of the American Family Survey several years ago and invited Richard Reeves of Brookings and Brad Wilcox of UVA and AEI and me to be advisors on the survey. Richard wanted to be here today, but he was unable to do so. We're very fortunate that Brookings Senior Fellow, Isabel Sawhill, is able to take his place. Belle tells me she's been at AEI every day this week, so we are especially grateful that she's making this extra appearance. Before we begin, let me say a few words about why I believe this survey is so important. As the editor of AEI's monthly polling report, I think I consume more polling data than most people in Washington. Every day, new polls cross my desk on the latest hot topic, whether it's the tax bill, Trump's popularity, the Russia investigation, or Roy Moore. It's important to understand how Americans feel about all of these things, but I've noticed over the last 20 years that they're crowding out many other important topics. Once upon a time, the pollsters regularly asked Americans about ordinary life. These questions are largely missing today in favor of the latest poll on political news or political scandal. Something very important has been lost. That's one of the reasons that I was very pleased to be asked to be an advisor on the survey. Knowing how families are faring is extremely important. But this survey does a lot more. As we know, family arrangements today are many and varied. But the large size of the BYU sample enables us to look with confidence at the challenges, the joys, and the frustrations of traditional married couples, single-parent families, cohabiting couples, and the like. Let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to proceed this morning. First, Doug Wilkes, who's the editor and the head content officer of the Deseret News, will speak. Then we will turn to the BYU team, Jeremy Pope and Chris Kaparwitz, to talk about the results from this year's survey. Jeremy worked as an RA in AEI's Political Corner quite a few years ago, and we're very pleased to welcome him back. Then Brad Wilcox and Isabel Sawhill will join Jeremy and Chris for a discussion that I will moderate. Now let me turn the proceedings over to Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlin. My remarks will be very, very brief so we can get to the heart of the presentation. We're very, very happy to be here. The Deseret News is based in Salt Lake City. We began this American Family Survey 3 years ago because we wanted to get into the heart of America. And with every passing year, it's going to become more and more pertinent, more and more valuable, the survey. When we started, you know, some of the nationalistic movement across the country, the election of Donald Trump, none of that was in play. But now today, obviously, that is in play. And by a survey of this kind, we can get further into understanding what's happening in America, not just on the East and West Coast, but truly in those cities and towns where sometimes the voices are not heard as loudly as on the coast. Today, for example, we will see through this survey a growing number of Americans say that the cost of raising a family and high work demands on parents are the most important problems facing families today, while fewer are pointing to sexual permissiveness in society and the availability of drugs and alcohol. Parents still think that people not disciplining their children is a key finding that we see year after year after year. And you can look at correlations, perhaps, and I'll let the experts talk about this, but correlations, perhaps, between the pressure on a family to have economics driving them, maybe there's a correlation to not being able to discipline your children. So we're trying to understand the lived experiences of Americans and their relationships with their families and how they relate to their attitudes about a variety of different political and social issues. This year we're talking about phones and social media usage, addiction, and healthcare. In previous iterations of the American Family Survey, an important finding was that family practices, such as time spent together at dinner or in family activities, are very similar across all different kinds of families and ideological perspectives. But a theme of this year's survey, by contrast, is the diversity of experiences that affect families. And though there is a great deal of talk in the country about racial, ethnic, religious, or ideological diversity, we've not always paid sufficient attention to how different life experiences related to healthcare or addiction or technology use affect American families. And this gives data, for example, on the opioid crisis, which we've heard so much about, and there's such a national crisis going on. But this truly feels like it's affecting families, much like alcohol affects families. But so with that, I'll thank you for coming. And again, the Deseret News is happy to be a part of this today. And we'll turn it over to our experts. Thank you.
It's great to be here with you. My name is Chris Karpowitz. Jeremy and I are the co-directors of the Center for the Study of Elections and Democracy at BYU, and we're delighted today to talk about marriage and family in the age of Trump. This is the third iteration of the American Family Survey. We began in 2015. Every year, it's a study of 3,000 adult Americans whose characteristics mirror those of the general population. The survey is fielded online by YouGov, and our strategy for this survey is to each year ask a core of questions about the health of marriages and families, and then also to have unique modules each year that explore distinct topics. And I'll talk more about the modules for this year. Doug has already indicated that we explored the opioid crisis, we explored technology, and so we're eager to talk about both what we're seeing in these core questions and what we're learning about specific policy issues. One of the things, now that it's the third year of the American Family Survey, we can look at trends over time. And one of the things we ask our respondents to react to is a question about about what the most important issues facing families might be. And we present them with a list of 12 curated items. Some of them are about economics, such as the high work demands and stress on parents or the costs associated with raising a family. Others are primarily cultural, such as the decline in religious faith and church attendance, or sexual permissiveness in society, or the widespread availability of drugs and alcohol. And then a final set of questions is about family structure and stability. Things like changes in the definition of family, or children growing up in single-parent homes, or the disciplinary practices of parents. And one of the things that we're seeing is that over time, since 2015, we see increasing concern, we find increasing concern about economic issues. So this figure presents the percentage of respondents to our survey who chose at least one of the issues we mentioned in the economic category, or at least one in the cultural category, or in the family structure category. So we see increasing concern about economics. That's moved from about 51% of respondents choosing at least one economic concern in 2015 to 62% in 2017. And on the cultural issues, that's fallen from 68% choosing at least one cultural issue in 2015 down to 51% in 2017. The thing that seems to unite everyone, you'll see there's stability and concern about the family structure and stability category. That's driven primarily by one question, which is a question about whether or not parents are teaching or disciplining their children correctly. So whatever else they're concerned about, Americans seem to be very concerned that other parents are not disciplining their children sufficiently. So we do see change over time. In addition, we also see political differences. So one of the things we're able to do in the 2017 survey is look closely at the differences between Clinton voters, Trump voters, and the sizable percentage of non-voters that we find in the United States. And we do see differences there. So this is the first year, again, that we're able to look closely at how people who made different choices in the presidential election are thinking about their families and their family experiences. perhaps not surprisingly, Clinton voters are much more concerned about economic issues than cultural issues. And for Trump voters, it's the reverse. So even though we see this trend over time in increasing concern about economics, we also see important political differences in how Americans see the challenges facing families. At the same time, so we've talked about change over time, we also see some important elements of stability. So across all 3 years of the survey, most Americans agree that marriage makes families and children better off financially, that marriage is needed to create strong families, and that when more people are married, society is better off. And most Americans disagree with the notion that marriage is more of a burden than a benefit, or that marriage is old-fashioned and out of date. And those findings have remained largely constant across the 3 years of the survey. Again, on these questions, we do see some political differences. There really are there is a political divide in how different kinds of voters see the symbolic meaning of family. And we're happy to talk more about that in the question and answer as well. We also ask people to tell us about the health of both their own marriages and families, and the health of marriages and families generally in the United States. And this particular slide focuses on the health of marriages. And this is a consistent finding over the 3 years. We find that most married Americans, feel that their marriages are doing pretty well, that they're either holding steady or improving over the last couple of years. They have a very different response when we ask about marriages generally in the United States. There, most Americans feel that marriages generally are either holding steady or getting weaker. And so that divide between how people see their own marriages and how they are regarding the health of marriage in the United States generally is an interesting one. We again see some political differences here. Notably, it's Trump voters who are most pessimistic about the health of marriage in the United States. Clinton voters tend to feel that marriages are sort of holding steady, that there hasn't been dramatic improvement or decline, whereas Trump voters are quite worried about the health of marriage in the United States. Despite those political differences, we do also find political similarities. That is, when we ask people to think about their roles as parents, so when we ask respondents who have children to think about whether or not being a parent is an important part of their personal identity, large numbers of both Clinton and Trump voters, and also non-voters, agree that being a parent is an extremely or very important part of their personal identity. So though there are differences in how Americans of different political stripes see the symbolic meaning of family, there are also things that unite Americans. And being a parent and feeling that role as a parent is an important part of their identity is one thing that unites Americans. So those are the core questions, or just a smattering of the core questions we asked. In 2017, we discussed several different additional topics. We had modules on different topics. One about technology and the role of technology. We talked about, we asked people about addiction and the opioid crisis, healthcare, and some other policy issues. I'll just mention one before turning the time over to Jeremy. We asked people about cell phones and smartphones and how the phone is affecting their lives. And the results here are fascinating. First, we find that when we ask people, who do you communicate with with your cell phone or with your smartphone, overwhelmingly they're communicating with family members, primarily the spouse. 8 out of 10 people who are married or in some sort of other relationship say that they use the phone to communicate several times a week or more with their spouse. And we see less communication with coworkers or friends relative to spouse and children. When we ask people whether or not the phone has improved their lives or is a good thing or a bad thing for their family, they report that the phone has been largely a good thing or had no effect. But when we analyze the data in a slightly different way, we do see some correlations that are notable. We ask people, for example, how often they use their phone each day. That might be a hard judgment to make because we use our phones off and on all the time. And in a different part of the survey, we ask people to report whether or not they're having relationship trouble or they've had relationship trouble in the last year or so. And what we find is that people who report using their phones more often are also more likely to report relationship trouble. So even though they tell us that the phone has been a good thing, there seems to be this correlation between phone use and relationship trouble. We can't tell what the causal order there is, obviously, but there is an interesting correlation. And with that, I'll turn the time over to my colleague, Jeremy Pope.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, I think I'm getting a text from my daughter right now, actually. She is having some relationship issues this week, and so she's probably texting me about that. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about some of those modules. Let me say, first of all, that one of the things we decided to do was ask people about addiction. And I want to emphasize that we picked addiction specifically, and our aim was to figure out what people believed about rates of addiction. That's a high bar. It is not the same as asking about abuse or use of drugs or things like that. But one of the things that we found that I think is quite striking is that rates of addiction to alcohol roughly are the same or maybe just a titch higher than addiction to opioids. We're hearing a lot these days about the opioid crisis in America. And I think it's striking that over 1 in 10 people think that there is someone in their family who is addicted, both to alcohol and to opioids. There are different ways to spin that. There are different ways to talk about it. But when we think about this high bar, someone in your family is addicted, about 1 to 2 Americans can say yes to that question. And I think that just highlights the, nature of this problem that so many of us are talking about. We can't know a lot about causality in this area. Chris said something like that earlier. And as well, I don't want this next slide that I'm showing you to be interpreted as a causal slide. We do not know whether or not having an economic crisis in your life leads to addiction, or if you have addiction and that leads to an economic crisis. However, when we ask people about whether or not they'd had trouble paying bills or going to the doctor, or if they'd had trouble paying food or paying rent, when we aggregated this, a lot of Americans have these kinds of crises in their life. It's about 4 in 10 Americans who have an economic crisis in the last year. And it just is the case that if you are reporting rates of personal addiction, that those rates are much, much higher for people who have had an economic crisis. These two things are obviously linked in some way. Again, it's difficult to say exactly how they are linked, but they clearly are linked. Another thing that we looked at was healthcare. And there is a lot on this in the survey. I'm not going to try to summarize all of it. Here, what we tried to do, and I think this is a fairly unique thing. I don't think we see this in public opinion as much as we should. We tried to ask people about trade-offs and what they would like in their personal insurance. So to give one example, would they prefer to have a low deductible, or would they prefer to have a wider network of doctors, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not going to try to take you through all of this because I think we can cover some of this in the Q&A. But one of the things that I think we find is that one of the things people care a great deal about, and this is true whether or not you're a Trump voter or a Clinton voter or a non-voter, is that costs come down, lower deductibles. People care a great deal about this. But they also care, and this is more true of Clinton voters than it is of Trump voters, that people have access, that we focus on making sure that everyone has insurance. Now, I do want to pause here and say there's a little bit of this that feels like they want an idealized healthcare system. So you want it to be very low cost, and you want everyone to have access to it. Would you like a slice of pie with that as well, perhaps a dollop of ice cream? But public opinion on this issue, people should take this into consideration, that the public really does care a great deal about both cost and access. They want people to get behind the velvet ropes, and then they hope that the cost, once you get behind those velvet ropes, is as low as possible. The last thing I'll say about this, though, one of the things you can see in this graph, if you look up there, the red bars are Trump voters, And as you can see, they're very similar to Clinton voters when we talk about deductibles and costs, but they have just a different view of whether or not we should prioritize lower taxes or helping the poor. They have a different view about pre-existing conditions. And non-voters, intriguingly, sometimes they're always in between. Sometimes they're a little bit more like Clinton voters. The one area where they're the most like Trump voters is pre-existing conditions, though, where they don't view it as quite as being important as Clinton voters do. Now, one of the things that we've done on the survey, and I think this will in the end actually be one of the more important contributions of the survey actually, is to look at people's social connections. And we mean this to mean looking beyond one's family. In other words, do you reach out to help for people beyond your family for financial help or transportation or medical help or something like that? And one of the things that we have consistently found in the last 2 surveys is that Clinton voters are more socially connected to their society, to their friends and neighbors than are Trump voters. Now, we can't speak to whether or not their individual family connections are as strong because we haven't fielded questions like that. I think in general probably they're equally strong given some of the other findings we have on the survey. But socially to their community, Clinton voters do have a stronger connection to their local community than do Trump voters. I think that's something that probably should be put in the mix in thinking about this most recent election. One of the things, and this connects to something Carlin said earlier, we want to ask some questions about things that are perhaps not getting as much attention as they should, especially as we embrace horse race polling in the world these days, which there is enough of that, in my opinion. We did ask people about how they're going to spend their Thanksgiving. And we didn't find enormous differences across voting, although I'll mention one of them in a second. We asked them if they're going to spend Thanksgiving with their immediate family or with their extended family. And I must admit, one of the things I realized after I really thought about this was, how many of you have read this story in the news, like how, I dread going to my extended family Thanksgiving? It actually is only about 3 in 10 or maybe 4 in 10 Americans who will actually be at one of those events next week. Most people spend Thanksgiving with their immediate family. And it's actually Clinton voters who are just a titch more likely to be out spending Thanksgiving with their extended family than you would see among Trump voters. It's not a huge difference, but I think that's kind of interesting. There we go. Lastly, one other issue that obviously dominates coverage of Trump and that is worth thinking about is immigration. And so we did a number of questions about immigration on the survey. I won't try to summarize all of them. But one of the things I would like to highlight is an experiment that we did. So we asked people, and here the wording is pretty important, do you favor or oppose the following policy, deporting unauthorized immigrants? In brackets there you see what the treatment on this question was, even when it separates families. So in blue there, you see the effect of even when it separates families. The gold bars represent what the raw results were, and the blue bars represent what about how you feel about this when it separates families. Now there is a pretty substantial difference here. There are a lot of people who are concerned about separation of families, and it lowers the favorability of deportation as a policy. But one thing that you can see by this graph is that there is a substantial difference between Trump voters, Clinton voters, and non-voters on this issue. Non-voters are the most affected by the treatment, but even Trump voters are substantially affected by being reminded about separation of families. That's a big deal to everyone. Now, let me just say a few things to sum up, and then we can jump into Q&A, which is probably more interesting to a lot of people. We see a lot of stability in our survey, but we do see some differences, and I think this year we decided to highlight the differences more than we have decided to highlight them in the past. And I think that's good because it helps us remember that there is a lot of variation in family experience. It is the case that both Trump and Clinton voters care a great deal about being parents, but there are substantial policy differences between these different types of voters in different areas. I won't try to go back over them now. One of the reasons that we put this survey together as political scientists is that we think our discipline doesn't pay enough attention to families and family life. In political science, I think it's almost fair to say that what we do is we say your parents transmit a party ID, and then that's all that we're interested in after that. And I think that's a mistake. I know Chris does as well, and that's why we were particularly interested in doing this survey, because I think it can shed a lot of light on a subject that we need more of in terms of policy, because there are a lot of interesting family differences, and people's families' experiences mean they have lots of different opinions about politics and policy, and we want to say more about that. And let me just conclude by saying how much we deeply appreciate both our advisory board and especially today Carlin, who has helped us put this event together. We're very pleased by it, and we really appreciate the attention here at AEI and everything that especially Carlin has done. So I'm going to say a little round of applause for Carlin. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Let me begin by thanking Chris and Jeremy for a very concise and thoughtful presentation of a survey that is extremely rich. It will be posted on the AEI website, and we have some copies available for all of you after this session. There is so much more in this survey than they were able to touch on early on. What we're going to do now is turn to Brad Wilcox and Isabel Sawhill, who've had time to read the report and study it, who've also plowed this ground extensively in their own research over time, to talk about what struck them most about the survey. And we'll begin with Brad, and then we'll ask Jeremy and Chris to comment on any questions or points that they'd like to make, and then we'll turn it all over to you for questions a little bit later. Thank you. Brad.
Thanks, Carlin. There are three things that I just wanted to touch on that are suggestive of the way in which I think this report is quite topical to a lot of the issues that we're talking about in the country today. The first thing is that some of you may have been following kind of the Jean Twenge iGen book and her article in The Atlantic talking about the role of smartphones and technology for teenagers. And the book, of course, is not without controversy. People are raising typical scholarly concerns about kind of directions of causality here. But she, of course, is arguing that sort of the rise of smartphones and social media are making teenagers less likely to kind of be in in-person relationships. And that has a range of both positive consequences, there's less teen pregnancy, but also negative consequences. There's more loneliness, more depression, et cetera, among teens. And she thinks that technology is playing an important role in this. So this survey takes us kind of beyond the teen years towards adults. We just saw a few slides ago that where adults are using their technology more than 1 hour a day, they're more likely to be reporting relationship trouble. And of course, we don't know, again here, the direction of causality. Is it the people who are lonely and feeling disconnected or who are struggling in their marriages or in their relationships are more likely to be migrating to smartphones and to social media? Or is it the case that spending a lot of time on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter is corrosive for your marriage or for your relationship? So looks to be some kind of relationship here, and I think it remains to be seen exactly how this is playing out, or if it's a bit of both. And that's actually what I think probably will be the story. But my point simply is that I think we need to continue to think about the way in which the dramatic technological changes that we're seeing unfold in the country are affecting family life. And just as a side note, we have seen a pretty dramatic decline in fertility since the Great Recession. And of course, the first part of that decline, I think, can be attributed directly to the economic fallout of the recession. But since 2014, the economy has continued to hum along. Employment's continued to fall. And typically, you would see births come back up. We haven't seen that. And I'm just wondering personally if part of the story here might be the role of technology or perhaps shifts in birth control. Or we've also seen sex come down as well. So something's happening, and I'm not sure what that thing is, but I do think maybe technology could be implicated in some of these shifts we're seeing in American families. The second thing that I think is, of course, noteworthy in this report is that they are looking at the role of family and economics when it comes to both the opioid crisis in particular and drug use more generally. And one of the things that they pointed out in the report is that adults who are kind of following the success sequence which was first pioneered by Bell Sawhill and Ron Haskins at Brookings. That is where young adults are getting at least a high school degree, then are pursuing full-time work, and then are marrying before having any children, are more likely to be steering clear of drug use or drug abuse. And of course, they've looked at the success sequence, and Wendy Wang and I looked at the success sequence in terms of the economic outcomes linked to this sequence. But it's certainly interesting to note that adults in America who follow the sequence are markedly less likely, more than 50% less likely to be abusing some kind of drug. And so having, again, some connection to work, some connection to marriage seems to be protective when it comes to substance abuse in America. That's the second point. And then the final point is that, from my perspective, that I thought was particularly topical, was that they are finding that there's kind of a growing concern in the public when it comes to issues facing families about economics, and in particular about the costs associated with raising a family. And so I think this, for me at least, brings to mind the importance of doing more in tax reform, which of course is upon us here in Washington, to address the costs of raising children in America by not only expanding the child tax credit, as the Senate plan has done, but also by extending that to more working class families by including payroll taxes as something that could be addressed in the child tax credit, not just income taxes. Recognizing, of course, that working class families are much more likely to be paying payroll taxes than they are income taxes, and we shouldn't lose sight of that reality in tax reform today in D.C. So those are my 3 comments.
Thank you, Brad. And Jeremy and Chris, do you want to respond to anything that Brad has said before turning to Isabel Sawhill?
I don't have anything to say. Chris?
No, I'm eager to hear what Isabel has to say.
Good. Belle?
Well, I thought that this was a very interesting report, and one of the most surprising findings was this shift from an emphasis on cultural issues to more of an emphasis on economic issues. It surprised me. On the other hand, I wouldn't want to overemphasize that. There weren't huge changes or differences. More important maybe was the fact that Clinton voters tend to care more and give priority to economic issues, and Trump voters to cultural issues. And I've been doing some research in this area, and I've seen that time and time again. I mean, that's just a very strong, widespread finding. And so I've kind of tried to think about that and what it means, and I think it relates to one's worldview. And let me try to articulate what I mean by that. One worldview is that your circumstances, the structure of society, is what determines how you behave. Another worldview is how you behave determines your success in life. And the first worldview is a more liberal view, and the second view is a more conservative view. Now, I'm kind of putting it in somewhat stark terms because it doesn't have to be either or. Both matter. In other words, the causal errors from your circumstances to your behavior go in both directions. And I think we see that time and again, both in this report and in other research, and it's very hard to sort it out. But I just want to emphasize that the differences in political worldviews do matter. I've been reading some transcripts of interviews with people in low-income communities, many rural communities, many people who voted for Trump, and take the issue of crime, although it comes up also with respect to addiction that's in this report. And a more conservatively oriented person will say, well, if you get involved in crime, your economic situation is going to fall apart. You know, crime is the driver here of the fact that you don't have opportunities, you can't get a job, you know, you screwed up, that's morally bad. Whereas a liberal is more likely to say, oh, well, the reason you engaged in crime is because there were no jobs, you didn't have a decent education, and it's not your fault. There are other root causes. So I think that somehow or other, politically, we need to get beyond this bifurcated view. We have to, if we're going to find common ground, we have to focus on values that we can all support, and I think those values are family, work, and education. And I'm writing a book now in which I will really focus on family, work, and education, and especially work. But we need to get over, simplistic ideas that there's only one driver of any of this. So that came out for me in the report. The second thing that came out for me in the report is the importance of parenthood. I think the fact that parents themselves get some of their identity from being parents isn't very surprising. If you're a parent, of course you have an identity of parenthood, so that didn't surprise me. But the fact that the issue of parents not teaching or disciplining their kids was so important and increasingly important over time did strike me as important. I personally think that having a child is about the most important thing anyone ever does as an adult. And I do think that marriage is the best environment for children, and I've written about that over and over again, and Brad likes to cite my support of that fact. Where Brad and I, and perhaps others, see things a little bit differently is I think he's more optimistic. He can speak for himself about the future of marriage, and perhaps Jeremy and Chris are, and this group is as well. I'm not terribly optimistic about the future of marriage, and I was somewhat surprised that the report doesn't show any decline in people's view of the importance of marriage, so that may be good news for those who are more optimistic than I am. I have written quite a lot about parenthood and the importance of what I call responsible parenthood. So the old norm was, back in the 50s and 60s when I was young, if you have a child, you should do it within marriage. You would be stigmatized if you had a child outside of marriage. Now, amongst millennials, 50% of children in America are born outside of marriage. That is a huge change, and one of the reasons why I'm pessimistic, and why I think if we could shift the norm from just talking about marriage, not because marriage isn't important and isn't the best institution we've invented so far for involving parents, both parents in their children's lives, but because if it's disappearing, we need to put more emphasis on not having a child until you and your partner really want a child and are prepared to be parents. I think a lot of this concern about the discipline and teaching of children is because a lot of people observe correctly that too many people are having children that they really don't have time for, that they're not dedicating themselves to, and that we have ways of dealing with that. It's called birth control, and I could go into that more if anyone was interested. One more point. I'm probably going too long. Okay. Work. I think of all of the three things here, family, education, work, the values that I think are important to all Americans, work is critical. And I was very interested that the report asked people if income wasn't an issue, would you still work? And a very large proportion said yes, they would still want a full-time or a part-time job. And I think that's because work is a source of identity. It provides structure to your life. One of the reasons I think addiction is linked to the failure of people to pursue the success sequence is because a critical part of the success sequence is working, and if you're working, you can't afford and don't have time to fool around with and get in trouble with drugs or alcohol. That's a little too simplistic, so I apologize because I'm not saying it very well. But I do think work is a way of structuring your life and feeling that you're contributing to society and that you're connected, you're socially connected to other people as well through work. I mean, here I am, I should have been retired 10 years ago, and I'm still working, and why am I still working? Because it gives me social connections and a source of meaning in my life. But I think that's true of almost all of us. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you, Brad. Thank you, Belle. And now I'd like to sort of drill down a little bit further on something that Belle just raised. Brad, are you more optimistic about the institution of marriage? And Jeremy and Chris, what has this survey told you over the last 3 years? Should we be more optimistic about marriage? And I wonder if you could talk about some of the differences between different kinds of family arrangements and optimism about marriage.
You know, I'm really actually agnostic about the future of marriage in the United States. I am hopeful about marriage's futures in general because I don't think there is an alternative really. I mean, we see, it doesn't matter if you're talking about France or Norway or, you know, the UK or the US, marriage is a much more stable context for the rearing of children. And I think, you know, people who recognize this, cultures that sort of understand this are going to flourish more, and that's just kind of a fact. But in terms of the United States, I think the story about marriage right now is more, I think, a kind of like we're in a holding pattern. So when you look at marriage rates, since about 2014, marriage rates have stabilized. And since about 2009, we've seen the share of kids who are being born outside of marriage actually come down just a teeny bit. And I think given current fertility trends, it's going to actually come down a little bit more, which is kind of surprising, given that it was kind of it's been increasing since the 1960s. So when it comes to kind of the share of kids being born in marriage, the share of people who are getting married, divorce is down a little bit as well. It looks like, again, we're kind of in a holding pattern. And the question is, of course, will that pattern shift towards, you know, greater marriage in the next 5 or 10 years, or a continued erosion of marriage, you know, say after this interregnum in 5 or 10 years? And I think that's an open question.
Jeremy, Chris?
I just want to, I guess, the one thing I'll add about this report, and maybe it splits the difference between those two perspectives you were talking about, is I'm pretty optimistic about marriage for the people who end up getting married. And so one of the things that I think we've found, and I don't really have statistics off the top of my head to support this, I'd go to a slide if I did, we would have some extra slides, but people who get married see the value of it. And one of the things we've learned through this survey is that people who benefit from social safety net programs see the value of those. People who benefit from marriage see the value of that. And you sort of need to have a certain life experience. I guess what I would say on, are we optimistic or pessimistic? I think people need to be shown the value of marriage, and then if they are, it's very likely they will continue to get married, and they'll pass it along to other people. It does feel like to me, and I think I would draw on other research here, that there are pockets of society that are not seeing the value right now. Young people have expressed the idea, frankly, that they need to be much more economically stable than older people think that they need to be to get married. Young people want to make sure they've saved up a lot of money, that they have fulfilled a lot of requirements, they have a really stable job, and older generations just thought you could get married at an earlier age, and I think the older generations are probably more correct about that. And what we need to do, if we're going to be optimistic about marriage, is convince people that it's a good idea. Once you get in, you're going to like it. This is one of the consistent findings in the survey.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I would say, in terms of optimism and pessimism, we see that people who are married do really like it. Except at the moment, if they're separated, if there's some sort of real issue, then they suddenly hate it. But for the most part, people who are married really see the value of marriage as an institution for raising children, as an institution that will help them find stability for their families in the same way that older Americans do. Now, I don't know if that's just a life cycle effect or not, given that we've only done this survey for 3 years. But I do worry that that the youngest people in our sample, the youngest generation, isn't quite as convinced that marriage is the right place for them.
Val, you?
I think what you see in the younger generation is a big increase in cohabitation and people saying to themselves or to their friends, why do we need this piece of paper, this legal arrangement? We can live together and have the same benefits that marriage brings. Now, I think that's a little wrong. Many of us, probably everybody up here knows and has written about the fact that cohabitation is, in America anyway, not a stable arrangement. By the time a child is age 5, an awful lot of these relationships have broken up. So it's really, marriage to me is simply a symbol of commitment to another person. You know, commitment through thick and thin, and commitment for the purpose of raising children, which takes more than 5 years, as we all know. So I also think it's very curious. I agree that there is this view amongst the younger generation that marriage should be the capstone. It's something you do after you've been successful in every other part of your life, and that's very different from what it used to be. But it's wrong because just plain economically and practically, being married is hugely helpful. You have economies of scale. You can pay just one rent and have just one car instead of 2 of everything. And secondly, you have the potential of twice as much income coming into the family. Or if one person doesn't work, you have the possibility of one person being a full-time parent. So it's just crazy to think that marriage isn't a good deal from an economic perspective, whatever you think of it in terms of its effects on kids and on other issues.
Well, we want to leave enough time for your questions, but I have a personal question that I'd like to ask Jeremy and Chris. This will be an argument that I will have with my 20-something children at the Thanksgiving table, and that is going to be about whether or not they're going to bring their cell phones to the table. And this survey has a wonderful module about parents and children and cell phone use, and I wonder if you could just tell the audience a little bit about it. Yeah.
I think Chris already talked about this a little bit. I'll just add one thing to this. And since you said it was personal, I'll bring it up here. This caused me to think about cell phone use at our dinner table. And I discovered my parents interfered in our lives, I suppose, by giving us this tool, Alexa, which sits in our kitchen. I don't know how many of you have an Alexa, but it's like this Amazon thing that you can talk to. And so we have never had like a strong tradition of cell phone usage at the table, and so it wasn't a significant problem. But I was thinking about it in relationship to the survey. The fact that Alexa is there now means that we often speak to one another and say, oh, I don't really know the answer to that question. And then we start asking Alexa as if she's sort of like a dinner table member. The reason that I bring this up is that one of the things Chris highlighted is that technology can support the family in the right environment. And I don't feel like the fact that my daughters and me talk to Alexa like she's a regular person and like our aunt or something in our family is a bad thing. I think it tends to be a pretty positive thing. I think that's one of the things people say in the survey. What I do worry about, and I feel like maybe we didn't tap this as much as I wish we could have. I think it's a hard thing to get at. There are danger signs with social media and the usage of phones. Chris already highlighted this with the trouble in your relationship. I think we're probably not as sensitive to that as we should be. We're very optimistic about our own lives. We see this when we ask people about marriage. Is your marriage great? Yes, it's fantastic. My children are great. Everything is good here. Other people, oh, they're horrible. It's like a dystopian future. Have you seen Blade Runner? That's what everyone else's family is like. So I'm worried a little bit about cell phone usage because I don't know that the right family environment is always going to be there to make it useful and good.
It's funny that you mentioned Alexa. My kids love to play Jeopardy during dinner on Alexa. One of the things we asked about this year was not only the prevalence of cell phones and smartphones, and there we find it's above age 12 when kids are typically getting cell phones and smartphones. Below that, there are smaller numbers of kids who seem to have access to it, even some very, very young kids. But then we also asked about the family rules for cell phones or smartphones. And we find that for kids who are somewhere between 5 and 17, about 4 in 10 families have rules about no cell phones during meals. And smaller numbers say no cell phones during family activities. There are rules about, some have rules about whether or not you can have your cell phone, kids can have their cell phones after a certain time of night, or total time limits. I was kind of surprised at the low numbers of families who impose discipline on the total time limit that children can use cell phones. My children would be very, very eager to see that we are outliers in that respect. But I do think one of the things we're trying to do with this survey is think about how technology affects the family, and specifically, what is it that families do? How are they managing this new force in the life of families? And some families do seem to be taking a pretty strong role in trying to manage kids' access to cell phones at various points during the day or at various kinds of activities, while others are not. And I think that difference is worth monitoring going forward.
You know, I think that the finding about extended families and Thanksgiving,
Yes.
that there were differences there, and not that many, although not that many people say they're going to spend Thanksgiving with their extended family. Well, I think a lot of them are going to spend Thanksgiving with Alexa.
Very good. Now it's time for your questions, and if you could identify yourself, we'll start with you in the back, right there. And there's a microphone coming right there. Yes.
Yeah, I'm Amy Wax from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and I have a couple of observations. The first is that the mainstream media clings to the idea that Trump voters are motivated by economics, and your survey really belies that, and it's never seemed plausible to me. Second, in Mark Regnerus's book, Cheap Sex, he documents a alarming decline in male marriage rates by age 34, like almost 1% per year decline, according to a chart he has in there since 2000. So it sounds like the existing marriages are more stable, but fewer people are getting married. So I would ask you to comment on that. And then finally, there's a class dimension here that I think explains some of your data on Trump versus Clinton voters. You know, Charles Murray has suggested that people in the bottom half of society, their families are much less stable. There are a lot of isolated men who aren't really connected to families. There are a lot of single women, so that might explain some of the feelings of isolation and the lower tendency to spend time with the community at large or extended family.
Jeremy, Chris?
I'll just say I think you're definitely onto something with class there. To get to more comments, I'll be brief and just say, one of the things that I think we make a mistake in terms of political analysis is we're always looking for one motivation for Trump voters or Clinton voters or whatever, and there are just dozens out there. What I think we add to the mix, and I think should probably be given more attention, is that Trump voters are a bit less socially connected to their communities. I don't see anyone else talking about that. I've seen a lot of the discussions of misogyny and also discussions of racism and other things like that, but there are other factors, and human beings are extremely complicated.
Let's put another question on the table right here in front.
Thanks. Thank you. Tim Carney, I'm a visiting fellow here at AEI. I'm writing a book on this topic, and I hope it comes out before bells. But
I'm sure it will.
On that question, yeah, I'm a journalist, so I think I write a little faster. But on that question of the social connectedness of Trump voters, I wonder, do you break it down by sort of Trump's core voter, or some of this data could be muddled by the fact that a lot of people voted for Trump because the alternative was voting for Hillary Clinton. Yeah. And so we're talking about his core vote. I mean, I've looked at other data that breaks down mass attendance, or church attendance, and Trump's earliest supporters were less likely than any other Republicans to go to church. But if you looked at just a general election, you would think, oh, Trump voters are more likely to go to church than non-Trump voters. So I would think the social disconnectedness would be magnified, is my hypothesis, if you could somehow break out the Trump support, because I think that social disconnectedness is at the root of all the problems.
So can I talk about that? I guess a little.
Yeah,
You can all talk about it.
We're in the midst of writing a paper, and that's shorter than a book, so we're going to beat both you and Beth. But we have broken it out a little bit by primary voters as well, and I do think it is magnified some. Maybe not as magnified as you might wish, but that's something we should talk about afterwards, because I think that's definitely happening.
Chris or Bill?
Yeah, I mean, I would just emphasize our data allow us to look at primary voters, so we can do that in 2016, and we do find a little more powerful relationship there. It's not gigantic, but it's there.
Question here in the front. There's a microphone coming. If you could identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Barbara Dello. My question is regarding family responsibility and values education. My daughter's a single mom, and she's an accountant, and she goes to work at 7, and she gets home at 7:30, and the kids go to bed at 8:30. So she has an hour and a half a day with her children. Does this give the daycare the cheapest she can find, and this public school's really the responsibility for value education? Is this something that, this value neutral education, what we're aiming for? And does it also create a void in caring for elders as you know, the parents get older?
We didn't look closely at the issue of daycare. That's a great idea for us to pursue in greater detail in the future. We did ask this year, when parents talk to their teenagers, what are they talking about? And we found that overwhelmingly what they're talking about is school. Yep. And grades. And far fewer report conversations about other things, including religion and values, so we asked about that. There are some differences between Trump voters and Clinton voters on that score, although I think those are mostly driven by the word religion. Yeah, we do find that that the rates of talking about those kinds of value-based issues are perhaps lower than we might have hoped, in the sense that when people are talking, they're talking about how are you doing in school and how are your grades.
Mm-hmm. We have time for one more question. Well, if we've answered, oh, there it is, right back.
I'm Danica Alink, and I'm with the Policy Circle. I just wanted to clarify the social connectedness. I think you mentioned the question you asked is if you would get a ride with somebody or ask it for help. And I'm wondering, is that what that was based on?
It's a whole battery of questions about various ways in which people might connect with their neighborhoods or friends or people outside their family circle.
Okay. And there's a number of ways you could slice it. The graph I showed you looks at it essentially compares the rate of answering no to all of those questions, so essentially never reaching out beyond your family.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I want to thank all of you for coming, and especially to thank BYU and the Deseret News for producing this absolutely wonderful survey, and Brad and Belle Sawhill for their ability to comment on it, and Belle particularly for your ability to comment on it on such short notice. And I want to thank all of you for coming, and we'll all stay around for a few minutes more. AEI is a very busy place this week, but we'd be happy to answer any other questions you have. So thank you so much for coming. Thank you.